Have you ever found yourself watching the news and just feeling like the world is getting more and more dangerous? It really makes you wonder, right? How much of what we feel about the world is real, and how much is shaped by the stories we're told, especially when it comes to something as emotional as youth crime?
So here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at what we think is happening versus what the numbers actually say. Then, we'll get into the psychology of how the media gets into our heads. We'll follow the money to see why fear sells, look at some real-world examples of how stories get twisted, and finally, see how this all cooks up something called a moral panic. Okay, let's dive right in. The first big piece of the puzzle is this huge gap between what we perceive and what's actually real. We are flooded with stories that make us feel like youth crime is out of control. But what happens when you hold that feeling up against the facts?
I mean, if you just go by the nightly news or your social media feed, the answer seems obvious, doesn't it? It feels like it's absolutely getting worse. But what if that feeling, as strong as it is just plain wrong?
And there it is. This one sentence really says it all. The actual number of violent crimes committed by young people is going down. But the coverage of those crimes, that's going up. That's not a small difference, that's a massive disconnect. So what on earth is going on here?
So if our fear isn't based on a real-world crime wave, where is it coming from? Well, the answer is more about psychology than statistics. There's this really powerful idea that explains how what we watch day in and day out literally rebuilds our sense of reality. It's called cultivation theory, and it's pretty simple, but also kind of mind-blowing. The more time you spend immersed in the world the media shows you, the more you start to believe the real world works the same way. It's like the media is slowly, carefully cultivating a garden of beliefs in your mind.
And here's why the news is so much more powerful at this than, say, a TV show. When you watch a crime drama, you know it's fake, right? It's entertainment. But the news presents itself as fact, as reality. And because of that, it has this incredible power to influence what we believe is true about the world around us.
Now, this effect isn't the same for everyone. Research shows that some of us are more susceptible to this fear amplification. If you've been a victim of crime before, for example, or if you live in a dense urban area, these media stories can hit a lot closer to home. They tap into existing anxieties and make the threat feel much more immediate and personal.
Okay, so if the news is distorting reality, you have to ask yourself, why? It's not some grand conspiracy. The answer is actually much simpler and, in a way, much more predictable. It all comes down to basic economics.
You have to remember, a news channel is a business. Just like any other business, it needs to get eyeballs on its product to survive. And this quote nails it. Their survival depends on ratings. That means the driving question isn't always what's the most important story, but what's the story that will make people watch.
And what makes us watch? Think about it. Fear, shock, outrage. A calm, reassuring story about crime rates slowly going down just doesn't grab you. But a single, violent, unusual story, you can't look away. So there's a huge financial incentive to focus on the things that scare us the most. Now, this pressure to grab your attention doesn't just lead to random scary stories. It actually creates these predictable patterns, almost like a playbook for how to frame a story to get the most engagement. Let's look at a few of these tactics.
You've probably heard of this one, missing white girl syndrome. It is a textbook example of market forces deciding whose story gets told. For a variety of reasons, stories about missing white affluent girls generate huge ratings. So they get 24/7 coverage, while victims from minority communities or poorer backgrounds, their stories often get little to no attention at all. It's a brutal calculation of whose tragedy is considered more marketable. This intense focus can also create something called a trial by media. Think about the James Bulger case in the UK, where two 10-year-old boys were accused of a horrific crime. The media coverage was so relentless, so certain of their guilt, that the public had already convicted them long before they ever saw the inside of a courtroom. It shows how a media narrative can completely overwhelm the legal process.
And finally, there's this really subtle but powerful trap, the follow-through failure effect. A shocking accusation makes the front page. It's the top story for days. But then weeks later, when charges are quietly dropped or the person is cleared, that update gets a tiny mention on page 16, if it's covered at all. The accusation is screamed, but the exoneration is whispered. So that first impression of guilt just hangs in the air forever.
So, when you put all of this together, the psychological cultivation of fear, the economic need for sensationalism, and these specific framing tactics, you get the perfect recipe for what sociologists call a moral panic.
It works like a feedback loop. Look at this cycle. The media amplifies a fear, let's say about teenagers. The public gets anxious and demands something be done. Politicians, sensing an opportunity, jump in with tough-on-crime rhetoric. The media, of course, covers all of this, which makes them money and reinforces the original fear. And just like that, the cycle starts all over again, getting bigger each time.
So what's the big takeaway here? It's not that you should just stop paying attention to the world. It's that we have to become smarter, more critical consumers of information. We need to understand the forces at play behind the headlines, which really brings us to one final question for you to think about. Now that you know how the machine works, how will you watch the news differently?